to round us off now, really excited to introduce or reintroduce to Rusi actually, because she's spoken here before, although we've not actually met, so delighted to electronically meet you, Pippa. Dr. Pippa Malmgren, founder of H Robotics, a Rusi Senior Associate Fellow. She founded DRPM Group, which advises investors on geopolitics and investment trends, served George W. Bush in the White House as a special assistant, and had responsibility for financial markets and terrorism risk to the economy after 9/11. One of the world's most influential economists and a renowned author. Actually, we've reviewed many of her books in the Rusi Journal, particularly I think Signals is one that I think is going to be particularly relevant to this discussion. But I'm looking forward to this. And for those of you who haven't seen Pippa before, there's a number of talks on YouTube. So if you like today, as I'm sure you will, you should check out some of her other content. But for now, absolutely delighted to welcome you to Rusi, as it were, Rusi's electronic home on Zoom, being watched by foreign powers, who knows, as we should be. What we're going to do is, this is about an hour long. I've eaten some of it just now, so we could run a bit long, I don't know. You're going to talk, I think, for about 10 to 15 minutes, but as long as you need. One of the reasons for those of you watching, obviously Pippa is not, a priori a nuclear person. So the question is sort of why. But actually, as we've just been unpicking in the last panel, these technological issues don't just sit in a silo and say, right, hypersonics, AI, cyber, etc. is relevant to nuclear. It's much, much broader than that. And sometimes decisions that might be taken in the nuclear field and look irrational for the sake of argument might have very, very rational reasons in another domain, and they might be more important. They might be perceived as more important. So I think we need to think broadly. So hopefully we'll get a broader perspective on technology futures, the practice of futures even, how do we predict 20 years from now? As we're showing, low probability, high impact events can really, really strike home. Some themes for today, Pippa, as you've not been here for the whole time, have been complexity, the rise of competition versus cooperation, the entanglement of interests at the same time as the entanglement of competition, and the overwhelming difficulty of regulation of new technologies, regulation of ideas. Clearly challenges in the nuclear domain. So hopefully looking forward to you opening our eyes to the broader economic and technological landscape, and indeed anything else you want to bring to the party. So Pippa, without further ado, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So, I grew up in Washington, D.C., in a world where I was asked to dive underneath my schoolroom desk once a month in a practice for a direct nuclear hit on Washington, D.C. And, looking back, I'm not sure why anybody thought being underneath your desk was going to help you in any way. But I really have all my life, by necessity, been deeply interested in this issue, also because by chance, it happens that my father was the person assigned by John F. Kennedy to oversee the missile trajectories during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so my own family experienced being at the front end of the decision-making in a moment of history that's, our baseline for today. So I want to step back, and I have listened to the presentations, which I've thought are absolutely marvelous, really, really good, and out of the box thinking. And just draw your attention to a news article that's dated from today. This news article, which I'll put up in the chat actually, it reads, "Risk to UK nuclear plants as China threatens to remove support." So this is interesting because how we think about nuclear weapons is very easy to think in terms of the obvious, the hypersonic weapon, the new developments. Not so obvious when you start to think about maybe the nuclear threat comes from inside the UK, from a geopolitical dispute that results in a situation where you have an unstable nuclear facility domestically. Now, this is what happened when I was in the White House in 9/11, and we were suddenly forced to confront the fact that we'd always assumed that the opponent was abroad. And so I was, as you mentioned, in charge of this issue of terrorism risk to the economy. One of the issues we looked at really closely was not just domestic terrorism risks, as in someone would bomb a shopping mall, but what if they broke into a dentist's office, retrieved nuclear material, and deployed it? And hence you have what we now call a dirty bomb. This is a nuclear threat on an extraordinary scale. And, I remember going through all of the scenarios and how how long-ranging the impact, 10,000 years. If you had the right kind of nuclear material, you could wipe out a city for 10,000 years. So I think that what's really important is to understand nuclear doesn't exist without an infrastructure, and that includes the infrastructure of your own thought process, the infrastructure of thinking about the issue. So I thought I would start by talking about some of the things that are changing the infrastructure of our thinking and of the world that apply to many things, but also to this nuclear issue. So one of them is speed, and the speed at which we are inventing new things, creating new technologies, processing information, and also having to absorb information. So you can't have nuclear without command control systems. Now, right now we are in a new race between the United States, China, and Russia in particular for who can have the fastest supercomputers, the fastest quantum computers, the fastest processing power. Now, processing power doesn't sound very exciting, but the fact is everything has physically moved location in the nuclear world since I was working for Ronald Reagan. That was my first job out of college. Star Wars, where we were going to stop these then equivalent of a hypersonic missile in space. In other words, stop it before it gets into your theater, into your domain. But today, with supercomputing, what you do is have enough computational power that you can break the other guy's codes, and you can stop it before it launches, or you can deal with it from space before it goes anywhere. And this is strictly a function of processing speed. So when we talk about cyber, people always talk about hacks, I'm talking about a world where this computational speed available means that you can solve an equation in 1 second that would normally take a human being 6 billion years to solve. So what is the power of your nuclear threat if it is vulnerable to this fundamental piece, which is all about speed and security of your command control structure? And that is why, for example, Summit and Sierra are the two fastest supercomputers in the world. Why do we keep them at Oak Ridge in Tennessee? That's not an accident. We keep them as if they are nuclear weapons themselves, because they are. They are the facilitator that permits or prevents nuclear weapons from being made capable. There's another speed issue which has to do with the speed at which information is arriving. And I'm also going to put up on the chat a little link. I just thought it was easier to do it this way than to do a separate PowerPoint. And that is what Buckminster Fuller called in 1982 the knowledge doubling curve. And if you pull up that link, you'll see there's a graph. And the graph shows that Bucky Fuller, who is one of the great engineering minds of the last couple hundred years, he realized that in the year 1900, the amount of knowledge, and we could argue about, is it knowledge or is it information? He thought it was knowledge. The amount of knowledge about reality was doubling every century. By 1945, it's doubling every 25 years. By 1982, which is when he's writing his book on the subject, he believes it's doubling every 12 months. And if we look at IBM's estimates today, they are in line with their prediction, which is that in the year 2020, knowledge is doubling every 11 to 12 hours. Now, the speed at which information is arriving makes it very difficult to make sense of anything, because no one can keep up with all the developments that are going on. And therefore, understanding the context in which nuclear exists and nuclear weapons exist, that alone is such a fast-moving, fast-changing space. I think it's hard enough just to keep track of what's happening in the nuclear arena, let alone the context in which it exists. So this is leading to a breakdown in our ability to make sense of situations. It's increasing the amount of input that people have and the sense of being overwhelmed. I'm sure everyone in this room, in this audience globally, you've all felt this feeling that you can't read fast enough. There's too much material to read. Yeah, we're all drowning in paperwork. And this has led to, we have to find other ways. And so instead of relying on reading the paper, we as humans drift into pattern recognition. So we say, well, instead of reading the paper, I'll just ask who wrote it. And if I agree with that crowd or that person or that camp, then I'll agree with the paper. If I don't, I won't. And this is how you get the kind of Fox News versus CNN crowd, where if it came from one and you're in their camp, then you agree. So this breakdown of our capacity to process the information means you start to lose all sense of subtlety, nuance, and all of that feeds directly into the quality of your decision making, the quality of the negotiations you conduct with it. I'll even recommend, and I'm really going to go out on a limb here, but I feel very strongly that this is a world in which it's critical that we widen our horizons, even though we're feeling drowned by the information that's coming at us in our own areas of expertise. The answer is not to focus further on your area of expertise, but rather to broaden out. Instead of the deeper dive of becoming more and more analytical, my recommendation is you must become more parenthetical. That means have greater ability to look across the landscape, to connect the dots between the silos, to comprehend the context, not just the subject matter. So I'm going to put another link into the chat, which is probably the other side of the philosophical spectrum of everyone in this audience, which is an extraordinary piece by a philosopher called Daniel Schmachtenberger, who did it for an outfit called Rebel Wisdom, which is probably a hotbed of people who are into things like Extinction Rebellion. You know, it's the opposite side of the thought process that exists in the world today. But I think his analysis of why sense-making has become so very difficult and why we can't even answer the simple questions, like, for example, the simple question, what happened to the nuclear reactor at Fukushima after the tsunami? I mean, really? We don't know where it is? We lost a nuclear reactor? No one can identify its actual location on the planet? This is a level of being unable to make sense that absolutely affects our thought process on everything else. And that's a direct nuclear issue, let alone things more broadly. So in addition to speed and to weight of information, I would also argue the location of activity has changed. And now this is why it's no coincidence that at this moment in history, we see the President of the United States announcing the Space Force. And I think it was only on May 15th that he unveiled the flag in the Oval Office of the new Space Force. And I appreciate that, you know, I have a controversial president, to say the least. We'll leave it at that. I appreciate that it's very easy to say, well, this Space Force is just, you know, his crazy idea. I don't think that's correct. I think that there's been a move towards the weaponization of space ever since I worked for Ronald Reagan. And I think it's accelerating now at a pace that is almost unimaginable. And the fact that SpaceX is putting satellites up at this extraordinary speed, but companies like Planet Labs that are putting satellites into space that I promise you are the size of a shoebox, and they're referred to as shoebox satellites. This is a democratization of the access to space. This is a tremendous shift in air power. It is a tremendous shift in data power. And I think this is a way to think about it. You know, in the past we had, and I've said this at RUSI before, you know, we've had our era of land power, and we've had our era of sea power. And for more than 100 years, air power has been the key to dominating. But we're now in a period of history where data power is the driver. And everything I've described to you absolutely feeds into nuclear infrastructure. And so data power in conjunction with air power at the level of space has definitely changed the context in which nuclear is occurring and nuclear weapons are being deployed and deployable. And so we come back to speed. If a commercial company can now get financing to put shoebox satellites into space, then we can only expect that the speed and the ferociousness of the commitment by governments to have these capabilities is going to absolutely change our definition of what is the battlefield, what is the domain of control. And we can be as diligent as we like here on the ground, but I think it's very interesting that the US and the UK and NATO countries, generally speaking, are not as comfortable or experienced with ground operations in the absence of GPS, in the absence of electricity, in the absence of satellites, and in the presence of things like EMP devices. These are new considerations for nuclear capability that I think we probably haven't spent enough time on. Now I'm going to add a few more things to what I have to say about infrastructure, and one of them is nuclear weapons also require public consent. And again, having grown up in the Cold War myself, this is about belief systems. And we had belief systems that the threat was real, it was worth fighting, that the Cold War was winnable, that if you spent enough, that would be the decisive factor, and you wouldn't have to use them if you spent enough money on them. And there was public buy-in to that. I think today, this is an open question. And, you know, Tom, as you said in the introduction, for me, we're in a very different economic environment. And I'll tell you something more precise about that, because I don't want you to leap the conclusion that we're going into an all-out recession in the 1930s style, because I don't think that we are. In fact, I think quite the opposite is more likely. However, the point is the public willingness to spend any resources on this subject matter cannot be taken for granted, because this isn't the world and the belief system framework that we used to have. So, for example, with all this innovation and technology going on, of course, people have gone back to nuclear power and started to talk about, why is it that we didn't ever develop thorium, for example? And part of the answer, and I'm not saying it's the main part of the answer, but part of the answer was because thorium didn't produce nuclear waste. And nuclear waste is what you use for nuclear weapons. So we didn't like it because we wanted the nuclear waste for nuclear weapons. Today, I don't think you'll find many people anywhere in the world outside of leadership positions, but amongst the general public, who think that that's a reasonable reason to pursue a particular type of energy source. And you're going to have a lot of people who are hugely empowered to find new solutions, like smaller nuclear reactors, thorium nuclear reactors, that allow you to get the energy without needing to create the byproducts. And that is going to raise questions for what's the nuclear industry all about if you don't have the fundamental material that fuels it. I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying it's an open question. What do we do? How do you think about this properly? And I'll say lastly, the economy is going to be an issue. And it was in the Cold War. The nuclear arms race was a business, and it did fuel GDP. And it did drive the definition of national interests. So today, what do we have? We do have an economic crisis. It's not exclusively created by COVID. If anything, COVID is, let me say this, it's affecting the economy the exact same way it affects a human. It reveals pre-existing conditions. And just as a human has, let's say, too much weight or asthma, or they haven't been looking after their health, and this reveals the problem. The same thing with the economy. We're going to find we have too much debt. We have insufficient cash revenues in the society. We don't have sufficient resilience. And therefore, government has had to step in and provide resources on a scale that really hasn't been seen since wartime. And I would argue since the Second World War. This is a dramatic increase in the shift to digitization. I would argue that we've done 10 years of a movement towards a more digital world and compressed it into 3 months. Now that means we get all the advantages of this, but also the disadvantage, which is a lot of human displacement. Now, personally, I think because we've thrown so much money at it, that we're going to find that there's a big wreck and then we get a recovery. So a bit, again, I hate to say it, but like COVID, some people end up on ventilators. In some parts of the economy end up on ventilators, and some won't make it at all. But the bulk of it survives and will be stronger and will be better because of the stress caused by these events. But in that new economy, the real question is, what kind of resources will the belief systems and the leadership structure be able to allocate to what we're talking about today, which is nuclear deterrent? Especially once they start to add up that what if you don't have a nuclear deterrent if you haven't got faster computers than the other side? That maybe the new nuclear spending isn't on hypersonic weapons, it's on a supercomputer, it's on a quantum computer, right? So these are all different ways of thinking about the infrastructure that surrounds nuclear. I'll finish with just one piece of the puzzle that came up in the Q&A in the last session. We cannot underestimate the importance of trust as infrastructure for nuclear deterrence. Again, you know, I remember going back when I worked in the White House and looking at Lyndon Johnson's White House, which is, you know, at the LBJ Library down in Texas. And that fantastic desk, little table, in fact, not his White House desk, but the table that the sofa surrounded, and it had the hotline to Moscow, right? It was, at its time, you know, it was the cutting edge of technology. The phone didn't even ring, which was a miracle at the time. You just were connected. Well, that also implied a level of trust, a belief that the other guy had a belief system. This world we're in now, I think the dialogue has deteriorated to such an extent that nobody even knows who to call anymore. I don't think we even have hotlines the way we used to have them. And even if we did, I think the level of trust has fallen apart on all sides. And I don't think it's immaterial that we live in a world right now where I'm watching General Mattis, who's the most respected person in the US military, whether you're on the left or on the right, basically say to the US military, he disagrees with the president's view that the military should be deployed in domestic civil unrest situations. Now that caused General Milley to have to make a public statement by doing the so-called elephant walk in Guam and issuing the message, don't think we're distracted just because we have all this stuff going on. We're still absolutely ready to deal with whatever. Now, did that message send that message, or did that message send the message that we're not ready and we are distracted? We can spend a lot of time arguing just that point. But I think that it would be silly for us to talk about a nuclear weapons world and not take into consideration that we do not have the trust and the relationships and the phone numbers and the infrastructure of trust that we used to have, where we could believe not so much of what the other guy said, but what were the other guy's priorities? What were the other guy's drivers? What could you be sure of? I'll finish with one small thing, but it's a big thing. I remember my dad telling me that when they got down to 4 hours, and they really felt in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were only 4 hours left. And the orders went out for everybody to go to the bunkers. And the first question that everyone came up with was, can I take my family? And of course, the answer was no. The bunkers are not designed to take your family, right? This is a national security crisis. You got to go, and you got to go right now. And everybody said, I'm not leaving my family if this is really it. This is the human infrastructure. And the human infrastructure at that time basically said no. Now, what we've been trying to do ever since is automate that while professing that we're not automating that. But let's face it, we're automating everything in the world economy, and we're increasingly automating nuclear decision-making as well. And as we reach that boundary that Norbert Wiener talked about, that cybernetic boundary of where is our willingness to delegate the authority to make a decision to an algorithm, to an autonomous system, to a robot, to processes that we can't reel back. This question is with us as heavily today, perhaps more so than ever in history. So while I really, really appreciated all of the previous presentations, I do think it's worthy of our time to step back and think about this infrastructure, this environment in which we're now operating, and really question our belief system of what is possible, what is right, what works. You know, these are open questions. Now, I've done this very quickly because I know also on Zoom, it's really hard to keep everybody's attention. You've had everybody online for a while, but maybe that's enough for me.